I still remember the crisp winter morning when my mother, Marilyn, called me to check if I was finally pregnant. Her tone was so casual yet so weighty that it made me feel like I was being gently suffocated under the blanket of familial expectations, even though I was miles away from her small hillside home. I tried to laugh it off, sprinkling a few nervous chuckles into the conversation, but there was a gnawing tension in my stomach. My parents had always been traditional in many ways, though they prided themselves on being modern enough for the world. But the one thing they held on to with near obsessive vigor was the idea of continuing the bloodline. They wanted grandchildren specifically from me, their eldest daughter, the responsible one in the family, the caretaker who always knew how to soothe the waters whenever arguments broke out. I, of course, had other plans at that point in my life. My name is Clara, and I was 29 years old when it all began, finishing up an intensive course in advanced geriatric physical therapy, a demanding program that required near constant focus. My husband, Thomas, was a civil engineer with an ambitious streak as wide as the ocean. We had married young, at least by city standards, but still felt that life was full of possibilities and that we weren't quite ready to have children yet. My younger sister, Cecilia, on the other hand, had always been the so-called baby of the family creative, spontaneous, and, according to my parents, in need of guidance from her big sister. A free spirit, she was sweet and charming when she wanted to be, but she also had an impulsive side that regularly landed her in questionable situations. I loved her, though, and never imagined the magnitude of the betrayal that would unfold. When I first noticed something off, it was a small, almost imperceptible shift in the way Cecilia and Thomas interacted. They would share jokes at family dinners that I wasn't part of. They started following each other on social media, tagging each other in memes. It was entirely possible that I was overthinking it, or so I told myself, because I was juggling my coursework, my job, and my marriage. I was exhausted from pulling late-night study sessions, commuting to the hospital for my clinical rotations, and trying to maintain some semblance of a social life. My parents, Richard and Marilyn, had begun to drop subtle hints at that time, remarks like, "You're not getting any younger, Clara," or "Your eggs won't stay fresh forever." They meant well, in their own intrusive way, but each comment felt like a pointed spear. The entire family, save for Cecilia, seemed to hold the same opinion that my delaying motherhood was some sort of personal affront to our shared legacy. And then, like a creeping shadow, the unimaginable happened. Cecilia became pregnant. But the father, it turned out, was none other than Thomas, my husband, someone I had trusted with the totality of my heart. The discovery shattered me in ways I could never have predicted. Even in my worst nightmares, I had never envisioned such a betrayal. I could not fathom how it transpired, or how everyone around me had become so skilled at hiding it. My parents, to my horror, seemed more concerned about the good name of the family than about the moral implications of what had happened. Their solution was to hush it all up, to bury the scandal and shift the blame onto me, claiming that if I had just been more willing to conceive, Thomas never would have strayed. That was the beginning of the darkest period of my life, but it was also the catalyst for my rise, for my transformation from a naive, overworked people-pleaser into a woman who refused to be used or scapegoated ever again. This is the story of my revenge, and how, in the end, justice and truth finally emerged triumphant. The first sign that something was amiss took shape a week after Christmas. At the time, my parents were hosting one of their traditional holiday gatherings. The living room smelled of pine and cinnamon, and the windows were fogged by the warmth of the fire and the crowd. Extended family members drifted from the living room to the kitchen, balancing plates of cranberry sauce, roast turkey, and gingerbread cookies. It was festive, bright, and joyful, or so I initially believed. I was snuggled into the corner of the couch, fatigued from a grueling final exam that had concluded only 2 days prior. My eyes roamed over the gathering, occasionally pausing to greet uncles, aunts, cousins. My father was stirring the punch in his old novelty Santa apron. My mother was fussing over the arrangement of hors d'oeuvres. My sister, in a shimmering red dress, chatted animatedly with Thomas near the Christmas tree. I remember the moment something twisted in my gut. I noticed that Thomas gently touched Cecilia's arm like a reassuring pat, but a little too slow to be casual. Then they caught each other's eyes, as if sharing a secret. A flicker of something intangible passed between them. In a single heartbeat, I shrugged it off. Thomas was a friendly guy, always pleasant, always ready to help. Cecilia, too, was affectionate with everyone. Maybe I was reading too much into it. I forced a smile and joined the conversation. Thomas quickly pulled me closer, putting his arm around me, as if to reaffirm a sense of normalcy. Cecilia gave me an odd grin, one that seemed both guilty and relieved at once. We exchanged holiday pleasantries. I asked if they were talking about travel plans for the new year. They both nodded too vigorously, stammering through some half-baked explanation about possibly visiting the coast. In that moment, an uneasy question sprouted in my mind. Why would they be planning something? Just the two of them. But I banished the doubt. After all, it was Christmas, and cynicism is especially unwelcome during the holidays. For months, my parents had ratcheted up their campaign for grandchildren. My mother, in particular, had a knack for slipping it into every conversation. If I phoned her to say hello, she'd steer the talk toward fertility. If I visited in person, she'd thrust pamphlets of prenatal vitamins and nutritional advice into my hands, eyes shining with an almost frantic glimmer of hope. My father tried a more jocular approach, teasing Thomas, "You're an engineer, right? Aren't you good at building things? Let's get started on building a family." Thomas would laugh it off. I would roll my eyes. Sometimes, though, I thought I noticed him swallow a lump in his throat. I chalked that up to his discomfort with their intrusiveness. Thomas and I had discussed having children on our own timetable. We wanted financial stability, a comfortable home, and a sense that we had fulfilled some personal goals first. The notion of rushing into parenthood never appealed to either of us. Whenever I apologized for my parents' meddling, he'd reassure me that he understood, that he respected my decisions, that children would come when the time was right. It was soothing hearing that from him. It felt like we were on the same page. Then, in a twist I didn't see coming, I began to catch glimpses of a different side of Thomas, a man whose patience was fraying, who looked at babies in strollers with a mixture of longing and sadness. One evening, after a stressful day at work, he sighed and mentioned how his coworker had just become a father for the second time. "It's weird," he said, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I never thought I'd envy someone changing diapers, but I guess one do." That was the first time I realized there might be an undercurrent of dissatisfaction in Thomas's otherwise supportive stance. I tried to talk it through with him, but he brushed it off, joking that he just needed a good night's sleep. I believed him, why shouldn't I? Cecilia came by to visit more frequently around this period. She was working sporadic gigs in advertising, photography, and design, whatever fit her fancy at the moment. She'd lounge in our living room, flipping through magazines, raving about new projects that might or might not come to fruition. She'd ask Thomas about local building sites, or just casually ask him for advice on renovating her studio apartment. They became friendly, which I saw as a positive development, since I'd always wanted them to get along. Naively, I believed that my sister was simply forging a closer bond with my husband. But every so often, I noticed fleeting moments like the way Cecilia's voice would drop an octave when she spoke to Thomas, or how she'd fix her hair in front of him, or the too long gazes they'd exchange when they thought I wasn't looking. Again, I tried to bury those suspicions, attributing them to paranoia. I was stressed, tired, and more than a little fed up with my parents. I had no emotional bandwidth left to decode subtle signs of possible attraction. The day my world imploded was a gray Sunday in early spring. I was studying in our home office, fighting a headache that had throbbed behind my eyes for days. Thomas was supposedly out running errands, though I had no idea where exactly he'd gone, and Cecilia was AWOL, not answering her phone. My parents had invited me over for brunch, but I declined, saying I needed to focus on an upcoming exam. Around noon, I heard a car pull up in our driveway. I glanced out the window and saw Thomas step out, carrying a small pharmacy bag in one hand. He looked anxious, furtive. He disappeared inside, presumably heading toward our bedroom. Curiosity spiked in me. Why had he snuck in so quietly? I opened the office door just a crack. Then I heard Thomas's voice, hushed, but audible enough. "Here, take this," he said, presumably speaking to someone. "You should rest, Cece." My heart hammered in my chest. Cecilia was in my bedroom? Why? My mind spun with horrifying possibilities. I inched down the hallway carefully, each step a measure of dread. I could make out bits of their conversation. "Thomas, I'm so nauseous," Cecilia complained, sounding scared. I know, he soothed. "This medication should help with morning sickness. But we need to figure out what we're gonna do. Your parents will find out soon enough. And what about Clara?" The shock nearly made my knees buckle. Morning sickness? My sister? Thomas? I clapped a hand over my mouth, hoping to block the involuntary gasp that was building in my throat. My chest constricted with panic, heartbreak, and fury. But I had to keep my composure. I pressed myself against the wall to steady the swirl of emotion. Cecilia sniffled. "I'm only about 7 weeks, but I can't hide it forever. Mom's pressing me about my weight gain. She's suspicious." Thomas cursed under his breath. "Listen, we should talk to your parents. If we hide this for too long, it'll be worse." "What about Clara?" Cecilia asked, her voice trembling. My heart pounded. I clung to the wall, bracing myself for the answer. Thomas sighed. "We'll handle Clara. She's so focused on her course right now, so maybe she won't take this well, but we have to do it." I didn't need to hear any more. My entire world had collapsed in a single breath. My husband, the man I trusted, had impregnated my own sister. Shock, betrayal, despair, and white-hot rage surged through me. My vision blurred with tears. 1,000 questions clamored in my head. How could they do this? When did it start? Why would Thomas betray me? I don't remember how I got out of the house that day. I vaguely recall grabbing my jacket, slipping on my shoes, and driving aimlessly for hours. I ended up at a desolate park, empty because of the drizzling rain. I sobbed in my car, slamming the steering wheel repeatedly, chest heaving with raw anguish. I felt hollowed out, as though every shred of safety and love had been sucked from my life. Even as sorrow tried to crush me, a new emotion took root in anger so potent and fierce that it burned away my tears, leaving me with a trembling sense of cold clarity. I couldn't pretend this was some minor mistake. This was a profound violation. And yet, all I could think was how my parents would react. Would they be as appalled as me? Or would they, in their mania for a grandchild, rationalize it? I dreaded finding out. By the following weekend, the dreadful truth had reached my parents. I was the one who told them. I wasn't about to let Thomas and Cecilia control the narrative. I arrived at my childhood home, tears still threatening to fall, and requested a private audience with both my mother and father. We sat in the same living room where I'd opened birthday gifts, where we'd held family movie nights. Now it felt like an interrogation room, suffused with tension. My mother blinked in confusion. "Clara, you said it was urgent. Are you all right?" I had rehearsed my opening lines in the car, but the moment I saw their familiar faces, everything dissolved. I stammered out the truth. "Cecilia is pregnant. She's been sleeping with Thomas." My father's face drained of color. My mother's lips parted in disbelief, or maybe horror. She let out a soft cry, pressing a hand to her chest. "Are you sure?" she whispered, as if she wanted me to say no, that it was all a misunderstanding. I nodded, tears rolling down my cheeks. I heard them talking. I saw the medication he bought for her morning sickness. My father's hands balled into fists, resting on his knees. He looked stricken, furious, uncertain. Your sister, she wouldn't do that. But my mother was already trying to gather the facts. How far along is she? Who else knows? Did Thomas admit it? About 7 weeks? I don't think many people know. They were discussing how to reveal it. After a moment of stunned silence, my mother stood, pacing the room. "We can't let this ruin everything," she mumbled under her breath. My father, still in shock, hissed, "Marilyn, what are you saying? Our daughter, our 2 daughters, this is a disaster." I stared at them both, my stomach hollow, my jaw tense. My chest hurt with every breath. "What are you going to do about it?" I asked, the anger barely contained. My mother's gaze flickered toward me. There was pity in her eyes, but also a disturbing gleam of calculation. "We need to handle this quietly. We can't allow scandal to overshadow our family. If Cecilia is pregnant, then we must support her. But we can't let this become a fiasco." I clenched my fists. "You realize what you're saying, right? She's pregnant with my husband's child. How can we just sweep it under the rug?" My father let out a heavy sigh. "This is serious. I don't know what else to do. We'll talk to Cecilia. We'll figure out the next steps. But maybe we don't have to involve the rest of the family. It can be contained, at least until what?" I exclaimed, voice cracking. "Until the baby's born? Until everyone sees that she suddenly has a child. Do you think that's something that can just be hidden?" My mother shook her head rapidly. "We'll manage it. Just Clara, please calm down. You have your course, your future. Let us handle this. We'll make sure Thomas, well, he has to take responsibility, doesn't he? We'll see." The sheer lack of empathy, the focus on covering up the scandal, lit a blaze of resentment in me. They were more concerned with the family's image than my agony. My father, noticing my expression, tried to smooth things over. "Clara, of course we're sorry. But let's be practical. This baby is coming. There's no point in letting your entire future unravel over it." My entire future had already unraveled, but it was clear that their version of damage control meant pressuring me to stay quiet, to let them manipulate the narrative. I felt sick. I told them I needed to leave. My mother tried to hug me as I stormed out, but I pulled away, tears streaming down my face. Cecilia had apparently gone into hiding, or perhaps she was staying with a friend. She hadn't answered any calls from me. 2 days after the horrifying conversation with my parents, I finally received a text from her. "I'm sorry. Let's talk when you're ready." That was it. No explanation, no real apology, just a vague, half-hearted line. I stared at my phone, seething. She must have known the enormity of the wound she'd inflicted, but she seemed more concerned with giving me space than with truly admitting her wrongdoing. Thomas, for his part, had moved into a hotel, leaving me a note scrawled on a piece of stationery. "I'm sorry. We need to talk, but I'll give you some time." Over the subsequent days, he tried calling, texting, emailing, begging for a chance to explain. I ignored him. The heartbreak was too fresh, the betrayal too enormous. My mind kept replaying the last few months, searching for red flags, for warning signs I'd missed. In the meantime, my parents began orchestrating some bizarre damage control plan. I heard from relatives that they'd told them I was under a lot of stress from my course, and acting out, claiming that my tension had taken a toll on my marriage. One aunt asked me, point blank, "Why don't you just give your parents what they want? Maybe then Thomas wouldn't have gone behind your back." The insinuation was appalling that my refusal to get pregnant was the real cause for all this. I asked how my parents got such twisted notions into everyone's heads, and she shrugged. "They said you've been pushing your husband away, focusing too much on your career. Men have needs, dear. If you're not fulfilling them," she trailed off, letting the condemnation hang in the air. Disgust and betrayal gnawed at my insides. My family was effectively blaming me for my own husband's infidelity. The cruelty left me speechless. Yet a part of me wondered if my parents were actually cunning enough to know that by painting me as the distant, career-obsessed wife, they could shift some sympathy onto Cecilia. After all, if I was the neglectful spouse, perhaps people might see my sister's pregnancy as an unfortunate accident, or a misguided attempt at fulfilling the family's desire for an heir. It was monstrous logic, but as I was about to discover, monstrous logic was not beyond them. In the midst of this turmoil, one beacon of light emerged, my longtime friend, Hannah. She was the only person who listened without judging, who let me cry on her shoulder, who validated my feelings when everyone else tried to gaslight me. Hannah insisted I needed legal advice, or at least a serious plan. Because this wasn't some trivial spat, it was a multi-layered betrayal with potential financial and emotional fallout that could haunt me forever. I contacted a divorce attorney, just to get a sense of my options. The initial consultation was free, but hearing the words division of assets, infidelity, and fault state versus no fault state rattled me to my core. I realized that if I pursued divorce, the entire ugly truth would likely become public. I'd be free of Thomas, but there would be no going back, no illusions left about my family's moral fabric. That thought shook me. Was I really prepared to blow everything wide open? Then again, how else could I preserve my dignity? Did I even owe them that? My parents had chosen to side with betrayal. Evidently, why should I protect them or shield their precious reputation? Hannah was adamant. You have every right to do what's best for you. If that means exposing them, so be it. Don't let them use you as a scapegoat. I nodded, tears prickling my eyes. But I also don't know if I want everyone to see my life as some tawdry soap opera. I feel humiliated enough. She grabbed my hand. That's understandable. But you need to consider your emotional and financial future. Don't let them walk all over you. In the days that followed, I juggled my heartbreak with practical tasks. I changed the locks to our house. I canceled Thomas's credit card, which was in my name. I quietly withdrew from a joint savings account, putting the funds in a separate account he didn't have access to. I wasn't sure if these steps were out of anger, fear, or raw survival instincts, possibly all three, but it felt necessary, if only to regain some sense of control. Eventually, I reached a point where I felt strong enough to confront both Thomas and Cecilia face to face. I couldn't ignore the matter forever. The pregnancy was advancing day by day. I called them separately, asking them to meet me at the house, my house, the one Thomas and I had built our lives in. Cecilia was hesitant. Thomas sounded relieved, maybe even hopeful that I was finally open to discussion. They arrived at dusk, the sky streaked with the burnished gold of a setting sun. I let them in, said nothing, and guided them to the living room where we'd once watched countless movies. Now it felt like a graveyard of memories. Cecilia wore loose clothing, and I could see a slight bump forming at her midsection. She looked pale, anxious. Thomas, on the other hand, looked ragged, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes darted around, probably noticing the small changes I had made Thomas's pictures removed from frames. His favorite blanket missing from the couch. I stood by the fireplace, arms crossed. They exchanged a glance, uncertain who should speak first. Finally, Thomas opened his mouth. "Clara, I'm so sorry," he said, voice trembling. "This was never supposed to happen. I never meant to hurt you." I let out a bitter laugh. "But you did, both of you." Cecilia's eyes filled with tears. I didn't plan this. We were just talking. We'd become close because Thomas wanted a child. And you, she choked up, her voice trailing off. My jaw tightened. And I wasn't cooperative enough, so you decided to give him what he wanted behind my back? Thomas rubbed his temples, looking pained. It's not that simple, Clara. We didn't set out to do this. It just happened. We kept telling ourselves it was a mistake, but then, a mistake you repeated until it resulted in a pregnancy, I said icily. You can't spin this into something accidental. You both made choices over and over. Cecilia sank onto the couch, tears trickling down her cheeks. She looked up at me, eyes pleading. I swear I didn't want to take him away from you. I never imagined. You have no idea how lonely I was. And Thomas, he was so frustrated. He talked about wanting a family, feeling overshadowed by your ambitions. One thing led to another. I tried to stay composed, but my voice trembled with rage and sorrow. So that justifies sleeping together? You think it's my fault for not having kids on your preferred timetable? Thomas lowered his head. No, it doesn't justify it. I was wrong. And I have to live with that for the rest of my life. Yeah, you do, I retorted. I glared at Cecilia's growing belly. And apparently, so does an innocent child that's going to be brought into this messed up situation. She flinched, placing a hand protectively over her abdomen. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of sadness for that unborn child. None of this was the baby's fault, but the rage quickly overshadowed any compassion. I looked each of them in the eye. "Our marriage is over," I said, directing the words at Thomas. His face tightened, tears threatening to spill. I then turned to Cecilia. "And you are no longer my sister, as far as I'm concerned." "Clara," she started to say, but I held up a hand. "No, don't speak. Whatever bond we had is gone. You broke it. You both betrayed me in the deepest way possible. There's no fixing that." Thomas tried to approach me, arms extended as if to offer a consoling hug. I stepped back. "Don't," I hissed. "You lost the right to comfort me." Silence crashed over us, thick and oppressive. Cecilia sobbed. Thomas's breathing was ragged, and I stood there, trembling. Part of me felt a savage satisfaction in delivering my final verdict. Another part felt the anguish of a lifetime's worth of familial closeness unraveling at my feet. When I commanded them to leave, they hesitated, but eventually they made their exit. Thomas paused at the door, tears finally escaping his eyes. He swallowed hard. "I'll be in touch about the divorce proceedings," he said quietly. I simply nodded, unable to muster words. The door clicked shut, and I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. The confrontation had ended, but the war for my dignity had only just begun. In the days following that confrontation, my parents launched a full-scale campaign to twist the narrative. They visited me unannounced, pressing me to reconsider, to be rational, to see that the child is still your flesh and blood. My father insisted that, as the older sister, it was my responsibility to show compassion, to avoid letting petty jealousy tear the family apart. I was stunned by their audacity. Jealousy? They thought my fury over an affair and pregnancy was mere jealousy? They tried to guilt-trip me into thinking that if I allowed this scandal to leak out, the extended family and the world would ostracize us. They said it would cause irreparable harm to Cecilia's future, to the baby's future. I finally snapped. "That's not my problem. She made her choice. Thomas made his choice. Now they'll face the consequences." My mother started to cry. She railed at me, blaming my infatuation with my course, claiming that if I hadn't been so stubborn about delaying pregnancy, none of this would have happened. I stood firm, refusing to be gaslit, though inside, each accusation felt like a fresh wound. My father tried to calm her down, but he also threw out lines like, "It's not too late. Maybe you can still work things out with Thomas. Children need their father." I realized then just how little my feelings mattered to them. Thomas and Cecilia's unborn baby had become the new focal point of their worldview, overshadowing even their own loyalty to me. In their eyes, a grandchild was a grandchild, no matter how it was conceived. My heartbreak, my dignity, my sense of betrayal, all of it was secondary to the potential of that child. I kicked them out, literally told them to leave my house. My father turned red, outraged, but my mother was sobbing, pleading for me to come around. My heart was shattered all over again, but I didn't budge. I slammed the door, pressed my back against it, and slid to the ground, tears burning trails down my face. The silence that followed was both agonizing and liberating. True to his word, Thomas reached out regarding the divorce. Through lawyers, we hashed out the initial steps, the separation of assets, the house, potential alimony. Despite his betrayal, we were in a no-fault divorce state, which meant the court wouldn't necessarily take infidelity into account when splitting property, except under specific circumstances. The process was draining, not just financially but emotionally. His lawyer tried to coax me into a settlement agreement. They claimed Thomas felt terrible and wanted to ensure I was taken care of. At first, I was livid he was the one who had destroyed our marriage. Why should he get a chance to play the benevolent party now? But after some thought, I realized it might be smarter to settle quickly. I needed to extricate myself from this nightmare and move forward with my life. I enlisted a formidable attorney, a steely-eyed woman named Michelle, who specialized in high-conflict divorces. She was direct, telling me I had a strong case to argue for a favorable division because of the emotional distress. If we could prove that Thomas's affair caused me undue psychological or financial harm, we might get some leverage. But the path would be messy and time-consuming, requiring depositions, testimonies, all of which could blow the scandal wide open. I hesitated. Did I have the stomach for a public fight, pitting sister against sister, husband against wife, and dragging my parents in as potential witnesses? Michelle assured me that, in the worst-case scenario, we could use their statements like the aunt's testimony about my parents blaming me for Thomas's infidelity to demonstrate the manipulative environment. But I wasn't sure how far I wanted to go. Eventually, I decided on a middle ground. I told Michelle I'd accept a decent settlement as long as it covered my share of the house and some compensation for the mental anguish. Thomas, who seemed remorseful and anxious to move on, agreed to fairly generous terms. We began drafting the final papers. Despite our attempt at quiet proceedings, rumors began to swirl among the extended family. Whispers reached me that Cecilia had found herself pregnant and that Thomas was supporting her. Others wondered if I was infertile or if I had refused to conceive, leading Thomas astray. The narrative grew more twisted with each retelling, some versions painting Cecilia as an innocent victim of my callousness, others branding Thomas a lustful cheat. Very few placed the blame squarely on them both. My parents refused to give a clear statement. They seemed content to let gossip run wild, so long as it didn't harm Cecilia's image too much. My father tried to persuade me to attend a family gathering, presumably so I could play nice and quell the rumors. I declined. I was tired of being used as a prop. Then came the day when a text message arrived from an unknown number. "I know what your family did to you. They're telling everyone you're the reason Thomas knocked up your sister. Don't let them get away with it." The message had no signature, but I suspected it was from a sympathetic relative or a friend who had heard the real story. I realized that the truth was starting to leak, and it was fueling a whole new wave of speculation. I was torn. Part of me was mortified at the idea of my personal life becoming public gossip. Another part of me felt that maybe the truth needed to come out in full. Why should I protect people who had viciously blamed me for their own immoral actions? In the midst of all this turmoil, a steely resolve formed inside me. I had spent weeks, months, feeling helpless like a wounded animal being circled by vultures. But I was done cowering. I wanted justice, not just legally but morally. I wanted the family that turned on me to face the consequences of their betrayal. I wanted the world to see what they had done, how they had tried to scapegoat me. Revenge for me wasn't about violence or cruelty. It was about exposing the truth, ensuring that those who had wronged me could no longer manipulate the narrative. I decided to speak openly, to put my side of the story on record, no matter how ugly it got. I began gathering evidence, text messages, voicemails, social media posts, anything that hinted at the timeline of Thomas and Cecilia's affair. I compiled statements from people who had witnessed suspicious interactions between them. I saved every insidious message from my parents that blamed me for the pregnancy. I even recorded phone calls with relatives who were fed lines by my parents, revealing how the blame game was orchestrated. Hannah helped me piece it all together into a coherent package. The thought of using it publicly was daunting, but the mere act of documenting the truth was empowering. I was no longer the passive victim. I had a voice. Meanwhile, Cecilia's pregnancy progressed. She posted cryptic updates on social media about new beginnings and unexpected blessings. Thomas appeared in a few of her pictures, standing awkwardly to the side, never quite smiling. I suspect he was struggling with guilt, torn between his responsibilities toward his unborn child and the knowledge that he had destroyed his marriage with me. My parents, unbelievably, were beaming in those photos, congratulating Cecilia, dropping hearts and kisses in the comment sections, as if there was nothing scandalous about any of it. I found it nauseating, but it also spurred me to continue my plan. Even though I had made progress in the divorce settlement, I wasn't done. A quiet end to this saga would allow them to rewrite the story as they wished, forever casting me as the frigid, uncooperative wife. I decided that I would air the truth. Maybe that was petty. Maybe it was vindictive. But I felt it was necessary for my own healing. I confronted Thomas one final time before pulling the trigger. I asked him directly, "Do you plan on publicly owning up to what you did?" He looked defeated. "I will, if it comes to that," he said. "But your parents want to keep it quiet for Cecilia's sake, for the baby's sake. They think the less people know, the better." "They only care about their image," I responded coldly. "They don't care how much this hurts me or even you." Thomas nodded, eyes downcast. "I'm sorry. I really am," he sighed. "If you decide to tell people, I won't stop you. I won't lie either. I've done enough damage." That was as close to an admission of guilt as he'd given, and perhaps a small measure of redemption, but it was too late to fix anything between us. I wrote an open letter addressed to my extended family and close friends, everyone who had heard rumors and half-truths, everyone who might have judged me. In that letter, I laid out the facts. Thomas and I had postponed having children by mutual agreement. Thomas began an affair with my sister Cecilia during a time when I was heavily focused on my professional development. My parents had discovered or suspected it, yet chose to conceal it, going so far as to blame me for neglecting my husband. Cecilia was pregnant, and the father was Thomas. The shame and betrayal I felt was immense, and I was divorcing Thomas. I refused to be scapegoated any longer. I wrote it carefully, with no gratuitous bitterness, simply a calm recounting of events. Then I emailed it to every relevant person in the family. I also posted it on a private social media group that included my extended relatives. Within hours, I received a flood of responses. Some were messages of shock, others of support, and still others were laced with disbelief or judgment. My father called me in a rage. "How could you do this? You're tearing the family apart." My mother left sobbing voicemails, accusing me of destroying Cecilia's reputation. But it was their own actions that had sown the seeds of destruction. All I did was shed light on the truth. In the days that followed, the family fractured into factions. Some sided with me, horrified by the betrayal. Others clung to the notion that I was being dramatic or petty. A few refused to take sides. But the important thing was, the truth was out. My parents could no longer spin a narrative in which I was the villain. They couldn't hush up the scandal or bury it under their illusions of familial harmony. They had to face the reality of what had happened, and so did Cecilia and Thomas. Under the weight of public scrutiny, Cecilia began to crack. She deactivated her social media accounts, too overwhelmed by the barrage of comments, some supportive, many hostile. I heard through the grapevine that she struggled emotionally, not just from the shame, but also from the hormonal turbulence of pregnancy. My mother hovered over her like a protective hen, lashing out at anyone who spoke ill of her precious daughter. Cecilia eventually reached out to me, leaving a voicemail that was almost incoherent with tears. "Clara," she sobbed, "I know you hate me, and I hate myself for what I did. I was so stupid, so desperate for affection, for love. I never meant to hurt you like this. Please, the first so sorry, I'm scared, I don't want to be alone in this. Mom and Dad, they don't understand. They just keep telling me it'll be okay, but it's not okay. I feel like I've ruined everything." When I listened to that voicemail, I felt a war inside me, anger, sadness, pity, disgust, and a faint, lingering vestige of sisterly concern. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream at her. Part of me wanted to comfort her. But ultimately, I couldn't bring myself to call her back. I was still too raw. As the fallout continued, I took solace in the small victories, finalizing the divorce settlement, securing my financial independence, and distancing myself from the toxic family environment. I also advanced in my geriatric physical therapy course, eventually completing it with top marks, despite the emotional chaos that had threatened to derail my studies. But I wanted more than just personal healing. I wanted accountability. The open letter had been a start, but I sensed that my parents still clung to the idea that this was all just a misunderstanding or an unfortunate slip. They didn't fully grasp the depth of their betrayal. And so I made one final move. I invited them, along with Cecilia and Thomas, to a mediated family meeting at the lawyer's office. The The aim was not to reconcile, but to set boundaries, to ensure that they could no longer weaponize the story against me in any future manipulations. In that austere conference room, bright fluorescent lights bearing down on us, we sat around a large wooden table. My lawyer, Michelle, oversaw the session, with a professional mediator present to keep things from spiraling into chaos. My parents looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Cecilia's belly was noticeably larger now, and Thomas rested a protective hand on her shoulder. I tried not to dwell on that image. "Thank you all for coming," said Michelle. "We're here to discuss a resolution that respects Clara's rights and boundaries, while acknowledging the complicated family situation." My father frowned. "We're her parents. We have every right to talk to her without lawyers present." Michelle shook her head. "This is Clara's request. She wants clarity and finality. Let's proceed." I swallowed hard, then spoke in a level voice. "I'm not here to reconcile or fix anything. I just want to ensure that from here on out, you don't blame me publicly or privately for what happened. This was not my fault. You all made choices that betrayed me." Thomas nodded solemnly. "You're right. It was our fault." Cecilia sniffled, eyes downcast. "I'm so sorry, Clara." My mother twisted her hands in her lap. "We never meant to blame you, dear. I held up a hand, cutting her off. "You did blame me. You told relatives that it was my fault for not having children sooner. You spread that story, and I won't tolerate it any longer." She hung her head. My father stared at the table, shame creeping into his features. Finally, he mustered the courage to speak. "We were wrong. We were panicking. We didn't know how to handle it. But we truly regret. You all need to acknowledge that this is your responsibility," I said, my voice quavering slightly. "Own up to it, publicly if asked. Admit that I bear no blame for Thomas's and Cecilia's actions. And don't ever harass me about giving you grandchildren or fulfilling your expectations again." The mediator cleared her throat. "Is everyone in agreement that from this point forward, the affair is recognized as solely the responsibility of Thomas and Cecilia, and that Clara is not to be implicated or vilified in any way?" Thomas answered first. "Yes, absolutely. I take full responsibility." Cecilia, tears streaming down her face, nodded. "I do too." My parents exchanged glances. They too finally, grudgingly, consented. Relief washed over me, though I was keenly aware that no piece of paper could truly guarantee they wouldn't revert to their old narratives later. Still, having it documented, having it expressed clearly in front of a mediator, was a psychological victory. Michelle explained that if they continued to slander me or blame me, I had recourse to file for defamation or emotional distress, given the documented record of their statements. That might have sounded heavy-handed, but I wanted to ensure they understood the seriousness of the matter. The meeting ended. I left that conference room feeling hollow yet strangely empowered. I had taken control, refused to be their scapegoat. Whether they would abide by our agreement remained to be seen, but at least I had drawn a line in the sand. Weeks turned into months. My divorce was finalized. Thomas moved in with Cecilia, and they prepared for the birth of their child. My parents tried to make amends, sending me tentative messages, but I kept my distance. I needed space to heal. I focused on my new job at a reputable rehabilitation center, where I felt I could truly make a difference in the lives of my elderly patients. One day, Hannah convinced me to join her on a trip to a nearby vineyard for some wine tasting, a brief getaway from the constant reminders of my family drama. The vineyard, nestled amidst rolling hills, brought a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The sun was warm on my skin, the air fragrant with grapes ripening on the vine. As we sat on a rustic bench, sipping a delightful rose, I realized that I hadn't thought about my betrayal for nearly a full hour. That was progress. The next few weeks saw the birth of Cecilia's baby, a girl. My parents sent me pictures, looking overjoyed, but I felt no urge to respond. I couldn't bring myself to hate the innocent child, but I wasn't ready to play the role of an aunt. Not yet. Possibly not ever. And if that was cold or cruel, so be it. My emotional scars were still raw. Gradually, life resumed a semblance of normalcy. I poured my energy into my career, saving up for a place of my own. I reconnected with old friends, started therapy to process the trauma, even dipped my toes back into the dating scene, though I had no illusions about diving into another serious relationship anytime soon. Still, the mere act of meeting new people felt like a reclamation of my future. Months later, I received an unexpected phone call from an old family friend, someone who had once been very close to my parents but had distanced herself amid the scandal. She'd heard everything that happened, and she wanted me to know that word had spread beyond just our extended family. Many in their social circles were appalled by what Cecilia and Thomas had done, and even more disturbed by my parents' initial attempts to shift blame onto me. Over time, my parents had lost face in the community. Invitations to events dwindled. Old friends became distant. Their precious reputation, which they prized so highly, suffered damage that might never be fully repaired. Some might call it karma, but to me it was simply the natural consequence of their deceit and betrayal. They had prioritized image over morality, and in the end, that image was tarnished anyway. As for Cecilia and Thomas, they were living together, apparently trying to co-parent and build a functional relationship for the sake of their daughter. But from what I gathered, there was strain. Thomas struggled with guilt, and Cecilia wrestled with postpartum challenges, not to mention the whispers that followed them wherever they went. They had their child a living testament to their betrayal. If they found a way to raise her in a loving environment, all the better for the child. I harbored no ill will toward an innocent baby, but I had no intention of inserting myself into their world. When I heard about the social fallout my parents suffered, I felt a sense of grim vindication, but it wasn't pure triumph. It was more like relief, a closing of a dark chapter. I didn't rejoice in their suffering, yet I believed it was just. Actions have consequences. Lies beget humiliation. Betrayal reaps heartbreak and shame. Life doesn't wrap up neatly with a bow, but I did reach a point of closure that I never thought possible in the immediate aftermath of discovering Cecilia's pregnancy. My revenge wasn't a dramatic act of sabotage, it was shining the light of truth onto the situation, refusing to let them bury me under guilt and shame that belonged to them. I claimed my own power and watched as they had to contend with the wreckage of their own making. Over a year passed, and I thrived in my new career. I moved into a cozy apartment with a small balcony that overlooked a bustling city street, filled with the energy of a life that was still unfolding. I made new friends, got a promotion, and even adopted a sweet, scruffy dog named Milo. Therapy helped me work through the trauma and piece my self-esteem back together. While I wasn't quite ready to open my heart to love again, I knew I was on a path of healing and growth. One sunny afternoon, as I sat on my balcony, Milo curled at my feet. I opened a letter from my mother. In it, she wrote with an uncharacteristic humility, apologizing for the pain they had caused me, admitting that they had been blinded by their desire for a grandchild. She said she missed me, hoped to see me. She sounded contrite, regretful. I felt a mix of emotions, sadness, empathy, exhaustion. But I also sensed an authentic shift in her words, a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing that had been missing before. I didn't respond right away. Forgiveness, if it comes, would have to be on my terms, at my pace, and that's okay. Because for the first time in my life, I realized that I didn't need my parents' approval or my family's validation to feel whole. I could decide where and when to let them back in. As I watched the golden sunlight dance across my living room floor, I felt a soft smile tug at my lips. There, with Milo beside me, a fresh breeze coming in from the open balcony door, I closed my eyes and let gratitude wash over me. Gratitude for surviving the storm, for finding a part of myself that was strong enough to speak out, for having the courage to demand justice and fairness when everyone else wanted to sweep the truth under the rug. I thought back to the heartbreak, the betrayal, the months of darkness and anger, and I realized something profound. In seeking revenge through truth, I hadn't turned into a monster. I hadn't stooped to their level of deceit or manipulation. I had stood up for myself, demanded accountability, and set myself free from a toxic legacy. In doing so, I claimed not just vengeance, but also liberation and inner peace. And yes, in the end, justice was served. My parents, who had enabled the deception, found themselves shunned by many of their friends. My sister and ex-husband were forced to confront the reality of their choices. The rumor mill that once targeted me shifted to them. The truth had emerged, unstoppable, shining a bright spotlight on each lie. And in that searing glow, I found my path forward, a path filled with possibilities, with hope, and with the quiet satisfaction that, despite the betrayal, despite the heartbreak, I had won back my life. I finished my glass of iced tea, breathing in the sweet fragrance of blossoming flowers from the street below. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow across my balcony. And in that radiant hush, I felt a sense of completion, a sense that my story, this arduous chapter of it, had reached its close. I was finally free, standing on the solid ground of truth and self-respect, ready to write a new narrative of my own choosing, certain that the future was mine to shape. Justice, truth, and fairness had prevailed in the end, and that, I realized with a gentle smile, was a beautiful conclusion indeed.